I'm glad to have this opportunity to study Torah together. I hope that you're safe and well, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. To introduce the Parsha of Toldot, let me share with you the story of Kalman Samuels, who is the founder of Shalva, who recently wrote an autobiography detailing his life journey that's called Dreams Never Dreamed. In 1977, Kalman and Malki's infant son Yossi was injured and rendered blind, deaf, and acutely hyperactive. During the difficult and isolating years of Yossi's early childhood, his mother promised to dedicate her life to helping other children with disabilities and their families if Yossi's world of darkness would ever be penetrated. With much divine providence, they found an unbelievable woman who teaches Yossi the ability to communicate. And Yossi is a modern-day Israeli Helen Keller story. Inspired by their son's remarkable breakthrough in communication, Kalman and Malki established Shalva, an amazing organization which provides programs and services for children with special needs in Israel. And so the story that's told in this autobiography is about their son Yossi, who had a braille sitter, which he took with him to shul, repeating the davening at his own pace and enjoying every single moment. And at one point, Yossi asked his father, Kalman, as to whether the Almighty listened to his prayers. And when his father assured him that he did, Yossi asked, "God isn't deaf?" "No," his father told him, to which Yossi responded with a playful smile, "Does he at least wear hearing aids?" And his father laughed as he realized that not only is it true that God creates us in his image, but that we create God in a certain sense in our image. And that initially, Kalman probably thought that Yossi was asking if Hashem listens to his tefillot too, since he has disabilities and can't daven normally like others do. But really, Yossi was just asking if Hashem was like him, also deaf. And this story highlights, it's a powerful story, meaningful story, but it highlights being able to read between the lines of the questions being asked by others and the power of communication, because that plays a role in our Parsha. And when you hear about the story about Yaakov taking the bracha from Esav, the question you ask is, did it really have to happen this way? Couldn't it have been done differently? When Yitzchak plans to give a bracha to his firstborn Esav, Rivka, believing that Yaakov deserves the bracha, masterminds a grand plan of deception. On Rivka's command, Yaakov dresses in Esav's clothing, impersonates his brother, and in dramatic and controversial fashion, he receives the blessing from his father. Now, if you read the Torah closely, it's rather clear that Yitzchak desired to give a blessing not only to Esav, but also to Yaakov. He perceived Esav and Yaakov as two tribes of a nascent nation. Esav was a man of the world, while Yaakov was the religious scholar, Ishtam Yoshev Oalim, a man who studied in the tents. And therefore each deserved the blessing to develop their unique talents. But Rivka disagreed with Isaac, and she believed that both the material blessing and the spiritual blessing belonged to Yaakov, and that the tribes of Israel would begin with Yaakov's children. And the basis for Rivka's view, and this is important, was a prophecy that she received when her twins were in her womb. And the prophecy was that these would be two nations and that the younger was superior and would carry the national legacy. And therefore, by hook or by crook, and there's two ways to read the story, Yaakov needed to get that blessing. And it's a complicated and troubling episode, to say the least. What's the value of a blessing obtained by false pretenses? Do the ends justify the means? In other words, does the end of receiving a blessing justify the means of fraud and deception? And the Torah does indicate that Yaakov pays a heavy price for this deception later on in life. A few years later, he's tricked by Lavan with the wife switcheroo, and then traumatically deceived by his children when they bring him Yosef's bloody woolen coat. And so whether you defend the actions of Rivka and Yaakov or not, it certainly seems far from ideal, which is why it comes back to haunt Yaakov later on in his life. And the question is, why didn't Rivka communicate her opinion to Yitzchak in a straightforward, transparent fashion? Why this whole scheme? If indeed the prophecy took place years earlier, and that's why Rivka believed that Yaakov needed the blessing and all the blessings, why don't she simply share the prophecy with Yitzchak? And perhaps she thought he wouldn't believe her, but she could have said, Yitz, I don't think it's a great idea to give Esav the bracha. Let's talk about it a little bit. Hashem perhaps would have said to Yitzchak, like he did to Avram, Kol asher tomar elecha Rivka shema v'kola, that you should just listen to Rivka. So the question is, why this whole grand deception? And did it really have to happen that way? Couldn't Rivka, and shouldn't Rivka, have just come straightforward out and told Yitzchak about the prophecy and spoken about what needed to be done? The Netziv, Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, has a provocative suggestion that I think is highly relevant for our times and for our relationships. And it's a message that we need to consider closely during this highly charged climate, but also personally in our lives, in our homes. And the Netziv writes that Lo Haita Rivka im Yitzchak kamo Sarah im Avraham. Rivka and Yitzchak's relationship was different than that of Sarah and Avraham, or Rachel and Yaakov. That with Sarah and Avraham, it was a relationship of equals. When something came up, they would talk about it. And the way Sarah and Avram looked at it was that we're partners, and if I'm doing something that bothers you or that you disagree with, I want to hear your opinion. They had that framework of trust, which enabled them to communicate through the good times and through the tough times. With Yitzchak and Rivka, however, the Netziv suggests that they were righteous, and of course, people who shaped history. This is our patriarch and matriarch, for whom we have tremendous respect. But when it comes to their relationship, the Netziv says, their relationship was different than Avram and Sarah. When they meet for the first time, Vatika chatzif vatitkas, that she covers herself with the veil. And the Netziv infers from here that Rivka was intimidated by the awesome presence of Yitzchak. They didn't have that same framework of trust and confidence in which she could strongly present her opinion the way Sarah did with Avraham. And for this reason, she simply didn't have the heart. She didn't have the courage to take a stand and communicate with Yitzchak. And perhaps she felt that he wouldn't listen. And I think this is a crucial lesson for all of us, that yes, we live at a time of great polarization and divisiveness where it's hard for people to listen to one another. But I think it's important for us to think about what we can do, what we must do to raise the level of our communications at home, with our families, with our community. And it starts at home, really. And I think if a spouse comes to you with something to talk about or a problem he or she is having, that's a critical moment. How do you respond? Do you say, thank you for sharing that with me, I want to hear more? If a spouse comes and says, what you did hurt me or bothered me, do you respond in a way that's defensive? Do you deny it? Do you respond angrily? Or do you say, thank you so much for letting me know, I'm so glad you told me, and let's talk about it? And how you respond in that situation is crucial. And that's the way we create the framework of trust so that we can communicate with one another. And if we're able to communicate and listen to one another and share perspectives with one another, that's the way, of course, we can not just have harmony in the home, but that good things happen for us and for those around us. This whole story, the Netziv says about Yaakov having to snatch the brachos from Esav and to deceive his father, according to the Netziv, was because Yitzchak and Rivka didn't have that high level of communication. And it's a message for all of us to think about the way we communicate with others. We get thinking about that story I started with about the power of communication and reading between the lines between Yossi and his father. And to think about, to take care always that we never demonize, we never categorize, we never label, and we have an obligation always to act and to speak in accordance with our Jewish values of emet and shalom, always speaking and listening closely. And if we create that framework of trust for one another, and certainly for a spouse, for our loved ones, that's the way we could bring sort of light and love into our home and make a difference in the world around us. Shabbat Shalom.